Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcast and this is episode 30. It's a series of short stories and general ramblings about my 28-year career in the UK police force. So last week, if you've been following sort of in order, we talked about a post into Gatwick and some of the wind-ups that we got up to there. There was a lot of work as well, honest, but there was also some fun jokes for sure, and it was an enjoyable place, and it was good. As I ended up doing a year there unexpectedly because of 9/11. But by this time I'd been, an armed officer for about a year or so. Had a few jobs, nothing too exciting. And at the time, the force I was in didn't have ARVs, armed response vehicles, but it was something that all forces in the country were going over to. The Met led the way, along with the other bigger cities, your Manchesters and Liverpools. They certainly had a gun crime issue and needed ARVs, although I think, as we've discussed before, firearms officers and ARVs in particular, don't just deal with armed jobs. There's lots of other use for their skills besides armed jobs. So towards the end of my time at Gatwick, it was decided that ARVs were going to be set up in the county I worked in. So the obvious choice for the bosses that were kind of looking at this option, where were they going to draw, experienced armed officers from? Now, with a year in at the airport, I didn't particularly consider myself that experienced, and I'm sure nobody else did either. But, we kind of... I think we proved that we were reasonably reliable and quite good, at what we did. So we were the obvious choice, the obvious pool of people to start off ARVs. So everyone was asked if they wanted to get involved and if they wanted to sort of start ARVs and set them up, or assist in setting them up. And I think there was around about a dozen of us at this point. Pretty much everyone wanted to. I can't think that anyone sort of said no, they wanted to go back to response policing, answering the 999 calls, because it was enjoyable work, certainly for me. That's why I did it, and I think everyone else involved felt the same. It was certainly a challenge at times. So what they did first off was, having been accepted, there was a process you'd expect, an interview, and they knew me, but you still had to have an interview and a board and further tests and harder fitness tests. So we'd done a reasonably stringent one, but it was a step up for ARVs. It was another level of fitness required, which I got through. Well, I wouldn't say I cruised through it. Never been particularly fit or a good runner or anything, but I came up to the standard. So I was accepted into ARVs, and to be honest with you, to start with, there wasn't an awful lot of rule books to follow in terms of, right, how do you set up ARVs? You don't kind of go online and Google it and that's it. Obviously, some of the sort of weapons instructors went around to different forces and looked at how they ran things. And initially what they did was some old sort of nicks, some old police stations that were dotted around the county had some of their cells that weren't in use for prisoners. So they made the obvious choice for armories. We needed somewhere to keep the guns, and it was quite a big county, so you couldn't afford to all sort of arm up in a central place, because by the time you drove out, you'd lose 2 hours of your day driving out to the edge of your ground and then also back again at the end of the shift. And also, it potentially left those places vulnerable with no armed cover, while there was this changeover of shifts happening. So it was decided that kind of at each end of the county, as well as centrally, there would be an armoury set up. We already had one centrally, but the east and west, they basically converted disused cells in police stations that didn't do custody anymore, where you'd normally put a prisoner, because they've got a big solid door with a massive key, etc. And they fitted gun safes into those cells, and they were used as armouries. So the weapons and the ammunition were moved to those locations. Now, first off, we had to do an ARV course. Well, we'd already done our sort of 2-week AFO course, the Authorised Firearms Officer. And that gave us our basics, but that only really covered sort of containing places and sort of sitting up and waiting effectively for somebody to ideally come out and give themselves up. We weren't really wanting to go in at that point, and certainly the skills we had, we weren't trained for that. There was people that were, but they were, in short supply. So we did the ARV course, and this again was sort of dreamt up is not the right word, but they put this course together in conjunction with other forces, so they had a pretty good idea of what they were doing. And it was a really good course. It was 4 weeks long, I think, so we'd already done 2. So we could already, sort of achieve the classification chute, the sort of test level for MP5s, which was a Heckler & Koch MP5, a 9mm sort of carbine, a short rifle, really good, accurate weapon. So we were quite proficient in that. And then we'd gone on to do a pistol course as well, which at the time was a SIG pistol, semi-automatic, a P226, without being too geeky. So, that was the sort of the first 2 weeks of a 6-week ARV course anyway. So we were able to do a 4-week ARV course, which covered the other things that we hadn't touched on. So we could contain places, and we could deal with perhaps someone walking, in the street with a weapon that needed to be stopped. But not much more than that, really. We certainly hadn't done any sort of vehicle training, how to stop vehicles. Of course, we knew how to stop vehicles. We'd done it for our career at that point. But, doing an armed stop on a vehicle is very different. And there's different levels to that. There's kind of low-level, low-threat stops where you may not even have guns on show. It's a simple, it would look like a normal traffic stop to anyone else. But the weapons are there available should it develop, And this was for a silver commander, quite often a chief inspector, and also in conjunction with a TACAD, a tactical advisor, who would be helping that chief inspector decide the tactics on how we would sort of deal with vehicles. And that was all about sort of intelligence and information and conditions. If you're stopping a vehicle in rural Nowheresville, that's different to having to be forced to stop it in the town centre outside the primary school. That's something we try and avoid. But sometimes you just don't get a choice. You don't get to choose where you stop these vehicles, because you follow them intending them to stop in a certain place, and of course they just pull up and say, why are you following me? So we had the sort of low level, low threat stops, and we also then had your high threat, hard stops, which was a totally different beast. That was where vehicles were potentially nigh on forced off the road, if not crashed into, and to force them to stop. It's also part of the tactics as well, potentially crashing into them to totally disrupt them. In some scenarios, you may have seen on the TV, where people are out and smashing windows with batons. That certainly goes on, or it can do, depending again on this threat level, because that's all about shock and awe. If you're a bad guy and you've got a gun in your lap and you're thinking the first cop that stops me is going to get it. If you suddenly get, 2 cars you hadn't expected, because they may be unmarked cars, they might not be marked ARVs, crashing into you, and then suddenly you've got, 4 great big gorillas of blokes or women, charging at your car, shouting and smashing your windows with batons. And by the time you sort of recovered from that, you come round and open your eyes once you sort of brushed all the broken glass off you, to find at least 2 people with, arm cover on you, and you're staring down the barrel of a gun. So very effective, a hard stop, very aggressive, it has to be, but also massively high risk for the cops, in terms of, you are only ever seconds away from pulling that trigger in that scenario. And certainly lots of the training focused on decision making, the horrible scenarios of people, suddenly pulling out, mobile phones, and, if they're in an address, pulling out remote controls quickly and things like this. Really difficult decisions to make. And bearing in mind, you've got a split second to make that decision. Now, when these things don't come to court or inquest or anything like that, a jury or somebody sitting on a board with a number of other people has all the time in the world to sit there and make that decision. Do we think this officer, made the right choice? I'm not sure. Let's have a cup of tea and have a right good think about it for the next hour or two. That cop has had a split second to make that decision. And he's or she is almost certainly basing that on an honestly held belief that their life or another person's life was in danger. So, i.e. pointing a weapon at you. But where it becomes difficult, and there was cases years ago in London, for example, where information that a guy had a sawn-off shotgun, for example, in a pub, and that he had it in a plastic bag, and that he'd pointed it at someone, or I think he'd shown it to someone, and somebody thought, wow, that's well out of order, I'm going to ring and tell the police about this. So, description gets put out, he leaves the pub just as the armed officers are turning up, and whether he intended to, you have something called kind of death by cop or suicide by cop now, or whether he thought it was funny or didn't take them seriously. I don't know. But for whatever reason, he had that thing in the bag rolled up. Yeah, the bag rolled up tightly around it. So it looked about the size and shape of a sawn-off shotgun. And bearing in mind the information they had going to that job, when they approached him, he raised it up and pointed it at them like it was a weapon. So he got shot by the police. Right or wrong? You know, again, you've got time to sit there and decide. But try and picture, you know, that information you've got, that intelligence you've got, everything pointing to the fact it seemed to be a genuine weapon. And then you've now got, again, as we keep saying, a split second, he's now pointing it at you like it's a weapon. Do you wait? You know, maybe it's not. It turned out to be a chair leg for some reason, you know, that he'd raised up. And that, of course, made it all the worse. But that decision, you know, was made by that cop who, you know, really had to think, am I going home tonight? You know, am I going off my shift? Now, I know in other countries that perhaps wouldn't be a problem at all and no one would bat an eyelid that person had been shot. But in the UK, it's a massive, massive deal for police to shoot someone. And that went on for years. And that's the other thing, you know, with cops that pull the trigger, these things can rumble on for years afterwards. And a cop can go through a really horrible place, you know, really sort of go through the mill in relation to that. So there was lots of sort of tactics, lots of training. We trained for vehicle stops and vehicle searches. We trained for persons on the street. We trained for, you know, people on foot and running from us. We trained for rural scenarios, you know, someone walking across fields with a weapon. And we also trained for very much urban areas, you know. And we also obviously still dealt with containments of sort of keeping people in houses and keeping them surrounded effectively while we try and negotiate them out. But there has to be a conclusion to that. And in a scenario, let's say, where it's a siege and they're holding a hostage, maybe it's a domestic scenario and they're holding, you know, their other half, their wife or whatever, hostage. What's the step up to that? If he's got a gun, or you believe he's got a gun, and you've seen the gun through the window, what looks like a gun, because don't forget, you know, what looks like a gun may not be, as we've just discussed. If suddenly she starts screaming, or there's a gunshot and it all goes quiet, or there's a gunshot and she's screaming, you know, any of these sorts of scenarios, what do? Well, you can no longer sit outside and wait. You can't contain, you know, because you're literally, ultimately, our role as police officers is to protect life. So you have to get in there. And some people might go, well, that's really dangerous. You can't go in. But I always thought I was actually safer than ever when I was armed, because yes, I might be faced with an armed suspect, but I had the tools and the equipment to deal with it. I put myself in the position of the person inside who's just been shot or stabbed or something like that. They have nothing. They have no body armor, no protective equipment, no training, and they're completely relying on someone to come and effectively save them and maybe save their life. So that would come down to you as an ARV officer. So there was also an option of like an emergency entry and emergency actions, called various things in various forces. But ARVs had to have the ability to start, you know, effectively gain an entry. So that was maybe smashing down doors and getting into premises. One of the ways that you did that, and we were introduced quite early on, is to a stun grenade. Or a flashbang, you know, depending on, again, various names in the military, etc., which is, you know, where they came from, their background. Now, I remember having a lesson on stun grenades early on, and it was explained to us, you know, how you deploy it and what it should do. And they were saying, really, it's a lifesaver. What it'll do as an officer, once you deploy it into that room, it'll gain you those vital seconds to get in there and get some arm cover on a suspect, prior to them recovering and being in a position to shoot you, basically. Now, some of the training scenarios we used to do, you would take it in turns to play baddies. It sounds like great fun, and I suppose it was to a degree, but obviously in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, this is pretty serious and this could actually happen one day. So quite often everyone would be issued with paint rounds, you know, and you'd have body armour on, you'd have eye protection, and they would put you in, we used to use sort of disused buildings that were earmarked for being knocked down. So you'd have like an old office block or something. So it had a series of rooms or bedrooms or whatever. Great training scenario. And they didn't matter if you shot a bit of paint around, or if you smashed the odd window, or if you had to, you know, put a hole in the wall or something. It wasn't a problem because it was getting knocked down anyway. So on several scenarios, but one particularly when we were training with the stun grenades, we had eye protection, ear protection. I was put in the corner of a room and I was given a revolver with a paint round, or with more than, like 6 paint rounds in, and said, the arm team is coming down the hallway. They are going to search all the rooms sequentially. It was a corridor with various rooms along it. They will come through that door. Here is the revolver. You've got paint rounds in. Obviously, we checked that was the case. There was no live rounds anywhere on the place, so it was completely safe. All you've got to do, your only aim, is to shoot one or all of those cops when they come through that door. That's all you've got to do. So you're like, okay, and you're thinking, this is going to be easy. I've got this cracked. They're definitely getting it, no problems. So sure enough, we hear the shouting and we hear them, sort of systematically searching down the corridor and entering these rooms, and in they go. And they get outside my door, and by now I've cocked the hammer on this revolver. I've got it raised in the shooting position and my finger's on the trigger. And I'm thinking, the second that door opens and they come in, I'm just going to pull the trigger and I'll win. I will shoot them. So it got to that position, and what happened was the door opened and in comes sailing through the air something small and black. Now, it's almost impossible, even though I was waiting and ready for it and trying to not let it distract me, to follow that with my eyes as it came in. 2 seconds later, it explodes in a massive, loud bang and flash, a huge eruption. Now, I've got eyes and ear protection on, and I'm ready for it. And you still have no choice but basically to, sort of cover your eyes, put your hands over your eyes, put your hands up. And by the time I lowered my hands, which I'm telling you was like 1 second later, I was thinking, right, now I'll shoot them. I looked up to find 2 MP5s pointing at me. So it's a really effective tool, and there's different versions of them for different jobs. Quite often, if you see or hear a siege on telly in the UK, and when it comes to a conclusion, if stun grenades are used, you'll hear members of the public saying, oh, and there was all these shots. I knew someone had been shot. I heard loads of shots fired and all the rest of it. They almost certainly didn't. Stun grenades make a sound basically just like a gunshot. And if you throw a few of them in an address, bearing in mind the operational ones can have 9 bangs per grenade. So if I throw 3 in there, my maths is not very good, but that's a lot of bangs, and all of those are, have a massive flash and a bang with them. So really, really effective. And we always carried those in ARVs, as they still do now, I'm sure. We also had a baton gun, so that fires like a large rubber bullet. That was a less than lethal option. To start with, we didn't have tasers. They weren't in, but they came along later. And then we carried our normal sort of baton and pepper spray, pava spray, like every other cop did. So some really good equipment on the wagon, that you carry around with you and be able to deploy. So yeah, we completed the course, thoroughly enjoyed it. It was really good course, and I went out feeling, quite confident. One of our final shoots we had to do on the range to qualify was this classification shoot again, and it was much harder than the standard the AFO shoot. So it would be quite specific. You might have 10 rounds in a magazine, and you'll be told, run down the range, a 25-metre range, get to the 7-metre point or the 10-metre point, and then you fire, there's 4 targets that will turn. When the targets turn, you fire, 2 to the chest of each target, and then 1 to the head, or whatever it would be. They'd be quite complicated, so you'd have to think about them, as well as now you're puffing because you've run. And quite often they had the ability to put smoke into that range, and also they even had like a blue light that they could mock up to a car battery, so you could have smoke and flashing blue lights. Sometimes they'd even put like loud music on, get you running down the range. They might get you running up and down the range a couple of times first, just to make sure you're puffed out. But that is reality. You're not going to have this lovely shot where you stand there and everything's all nice and calm, and you sort of squeeze off the trigger and it's all great. It's almost certainly going to be under massively high pressure, and this is why, and we've talked about this before, the aim point is the center of the chest, the center mass you're most likely to hit under a stressful situation. So we'd had the shoot on the day, and it involved a lot of rounds. Something like maybe 100 rounds in very quick succession from your weapon being fired. And it tested various things, magazine reloads and all sorts going on. And when the shoot had finished, we ended up in the kneeling position. with our weapons pointing down the range in a safe way, safety catch on fire, but we hadn't used all the rounds in the magazine, so there was still a round in the chamber. So to fire that gun, all you had to do was flick it to fire on the safety catch and pull the trigger. That was it. So it was loaded, made ready. That's the term that we'd use there. Some forces again say state 1 and state whatever, but that's effectively where it was at. So we finished the shoot. The instructor came up behind us. We were all lined up, and we still had some rounds left in the magazine and one in the chamber, like I said. No one should have been shooting. You know, we were at the point where we were about to take our sort of eyes and ears off, and by that I mean the ear protection and you know, goggles or whatever. When my friend who was sat beside me, also in the kneeling position, suddenly there was a loud bang, and he fired a shot off down the range that went flying off down the range. But there was some shrapnel that was ejected out of the weapon beside me, and it actually went flying off along the line of cops that were kneeling next to him, and it went through the sleeve of my overalls and carried on and hit somebody in the face, thankfully fairly low level, and I think they just had a nick from it. But this poor guy, he was absolutely mortified because he knew he hadn't fired. And he was really keen to show me, look, my safety catch is still on safe. You know, I've not put it to fire. I've not had an ND, which is a negligent, I can't say it. Yeah, you fired when you weren't meant to, negligent discharge. So, you know, he was absolutely appalled. And, you know, that's why, like, instructors don't come and stand in front of guns on ranges. But, of course, there was a big investigation, and this poor guy was, you know, really concerned how it would affect him. But the reality is what had happened was he had something called a cook-off. They're quite rare. But basically, we'd fired so many rounds through the weapon that the barrel had really heated up. And now the one round that was loaded into that breech, ready to be fired again, sat there in the red-hot barrel and just sat there. And eventually, the temperatures got so high because they recovered the rear part of the cartridge. And the firing pin hadn't hit the back of the cartridge, you know, the primer wasn't dented, it was intact. And they think the temperature just got so high in the barrel that the round had just cooked off, hence the name cook-off. So he was cleared of any wrongdoing, but yeah, it was, it could have gone really, really bad, you know, and he was very pleased that he was exonerated. So that was quite interesting. And then, what else we had? So, fairly early on in my career, we were tasked to go down to what is now a city on the south coast of the UK. There'd been a shooting in London where basically a guy was sat in a barber's chair having his hair cut, and somebody had just walked in behind him, put a pistol to the back of his head and pulled the trigger. And as you'd expect, he was killed stone dead. Now, the information was that this guy had fled down into this city, and we had the address that he was meant to be at, and there'd been a lot of inquiries and also an OP, an observation post on that address, and they confirmed that 3 guys that fitted the description had gone into that address. So we didn't know exactly which one, but we were pretty confident our man was in there, one of these 3, and we were tasked to go and make the arrest for murder for this guy. And this was quite early on in my ARV career. So obviously it was a terraced house, i.e. there's houses either side of it, so there's no sort of side route options out. And then, so they can only get out the front and back. Obviously we sent, I can't speak today, sorry. We sent armed cops to the rear, and they put on a containment. And then we went to the front door where we knocked on the door, and basically it took several attempts, but eventually someone came to the door. And then you can imagine now, you know, this is absolutely, you know, the highest level it gets. This is a full-on sort of pointy gun shout thing, you know. So we're on aim, which means, you know, round in the breech, safety catch on fire. All you've got to do to fire that shot is pull the trigger, and the aim of your weapon is on the centre of that person's chest because he fits the description. So obviously you can imagine we're shouting and screaming at him to put his hands up, let us see his hands, and then step out of premises slowly. And then once he comes out, we get him to turn around and lift his jacket up and then keep coming. Eventually he's drawn away from the address where we cuff him up. Now the first one came out no problems, as did the second one, which led us to believe that those 2 almost certainly weren't involved. And in fairness, I don't think they had any clue what was going on, but of course they were terrified, because no matter how much of a hard man you are, you know, if someone's shouting at you, very sort of aggressively. In fact, if half a dozen guys in black or girls, are shouting at you and pointing weapons at you, there isn't many people that still believe they're hard men, trust me. And it wasn't unusual for people to wet themselves in that scenario. If we did, an aggressive sort of hard stop, quite often they would wet themselves. So 2 of them come out, third one's in the address. Now, the door is partially open on the front door, and I'm standing on the sort of door pillar, so hopefully only half of me is on show within that premises, because obviously I'm trying to minimise my chances of getting shot. This potentially is an armed suspect who's already killed someone and, quite frankly, has nothing to lose. So, as I say, it's about as high risk as it gets. And I could see sort of diagonally through the property, through what was probably a lounge, and then onto another open doorway, which looked like a kitchen. I could see some sort of kitchen cabinets and a cooker. And I could see that there was a third person in there. So I was shouting at him, come out, show me your hands, a lot more aggressively than that, I can tell you. And urging him to come out, there'd be no harm to him as long as he came out with his hands where we could see him. Don't make any sudden movements, etc. So this is the sort of thing you're shouting at someone. And you've got to really try and control yourself here, because don't forget your adrenaline sky high as well. So firstly, you go a bit high pitched. And secondly, it's very easy to sort of garble it, if you shout it too quickly. So they end up not being able to understand you, because don't forget, they also are under a lot of pressure here. So I say it really is a sort of dangerous moment. But this guy was in there, and I could see him bobbing about. He's kind of moving side to side. I was getting glimpses of his face and then of his hands, but I never saw all of him at all. So it was worrying times. As I say, the sight was roughly where his chest would be, that sort of height. The finger was on the trigger, and I knew that, should he come out with a weapon pointing at me, for example, then almost certainly I'd be pulling the trigger. So, and it was the first time I'd perhaps been in that position where I really believed it could happen the way he was reacting. Thankfully, eventually he came out and did what he was told. He kept his hands where we could see them, and he was brought out and he was brought into custody. And then obviously after an incident like that, you then go on to have quite a lengthy, involved debrief, that would go through, well, why did you do that? And why did you stand there? And just, it was more like a chat between friends, because it's really important to understand why your different colleagues did things, because you can learn from it, and they can maybe learn from what you did. Or equally, you might think, why did I stand there? Next time I won't ever do that again, And it also got quite heated. Sometimes colleagues, wouldn't pull any punches and go, you put me on offer by standing there. I had to stand out of cover because you were in my way. And you think, God, I didn't realise at all, So really good learning points can come out of those things. Very, very valuable. So we would deal with those sort of things, arresting sort of armed suspects. We'd also do a lot of what was called MASTS work, which is mobile armed support to surveillance. We've talked about surveillance before, and in a big surveillance convoy, you could have a dozen cars that were following this one person. Now, generally, if it was an armed job, you might have a couple of unmarked cars or a couple of marks, uniform ARVs tagged on the back of the convoy. Generally, you'd stay away from it and you wouldn't get near it at all. Because you'd quite often be doing sort of lifestyle surveillance on the person. So you're just trying to build up a picture of where do they drink, where do they work out, where do they go to eat, who are their friends, those sort of things. Perhaps you've got information this person is going to do an armed robbery at some point. But they tagged on the armed cars at the back of the convoy, because if he suddenly met someone in a pub car park and you could see there was an exchange, of a handgun or something like that, you'd suddenly think, wow, we didn't plan for this, but it looks like he's going to go and do it now. He's got the gun. So they might suddenly need to turn it into a full-on armed stop, So what would happen then, it would be quite exciting, is they would get the armed cars to make up the convoy and do the stop on this person. So what you could then have the scenario was, we might be a mile or two off the back of this convoy and off the back of the target, but the surveillance cars will be calling you through. Now, what can happen there is you can almost have something that looks like it should be in the Olympics, kind of everyone moving as one. You could have 2 or 3 armed cars making up through a convoy, and every time there's a gap in the traffic, there's 3 cars popping out and driving very fast and overtaking half a dozen cars at a time. But what can also happen is, and it looks like, synchronized overtaking is quite interesting to see. You could have a series of blind bends with solid white lines, so you can't see around the bend, and you certainly can't overtake because it's solid white lines. It would be suicide to overtake. But what members of the public didn't know was that, just round the bend, we had 2 surveillance cars already, and they'd be calling us and saying, it's all clear, come on through. So basically, around blind bends and solid white lines, you'd have 3 armed, maybe unmarked cars coming out at once, overtaking, doing 10-car overtakes and slotting back in and making up the convoy to get to the head of this convoy so that they could figure out the best place to actually do this armed stop. So a lot of masked stuff. That was quite interesting. A lot of the time sitting around doing absolutely nothing. But you always had to be on your game. You could have literally 10 hours sat in a supermarket car park waiting, and then 15 minutes before you're due to finish the operation and go home for the day, having done a 15-hour day or something, the target suddenly starts moving or the information changes and you have to go with it. And sometimes that would involve many more hours on duty. But what they did do after a while was start limiting how many hours you could do on duty as an armed officer, because you cannot make good decisions after a 20-hour shift, and that was proven. And we were very aware that should we have had to pull the trigger after a 20-hour shift and it eventually went to court, or some sort of inquiry or, complaints procedure, to try and convince, someone in that court, on that jury, that it was a safe thing and that you were, making good decisions at that point, was unlikely. So they started very much limiting the officers that the hours rather that armed officers could work. So yeah, ARVs, really enjoyed it. I had some great times, got involved in some really hairy stuff. And in fact, probably next time we're going to deal with the biggest incident of my career, I would say. A full-on armed incident that it didn't go wrong, but it went all the way to its conclusion. And we won't say too much about that more now, but that'll be next week. So hopefully you'll come back and listen to some more. I hope that was interesting to explain a little bit about ARVs and the course and what it's like. Episode 30, done and dusted. Keep the downloads coming. Over 2,000 downloads now, which I can't believe. I'm really pleased with that, so thank you. And please let anyone know that you think might be interested as well. All right, thanks for your time. Take it easy. Speak soon. Cheers. Bye.